take me to the legal term of occupation.
So occupation is a kind of trespass, right?
Okay.
You are taking over the home or the land of a place that you're not entitled to be in, okay? And so we should look at international law to decide whether the Jews have a right to be in the lands that they now are in. So, for example, there are really three ways in which a nation can become a state, okay? You can win it in a war,
Yep.
and there are two kinds of wars. There are offensive wars, like Putin's war in Ukraine, and there are defensive wars, wars of survival.
Yeah.
Second, you can have a long presence in the land. You can be the indigenous people of the land who finally fights to decolonize and to win back the land for your people. Third, you can have a legal deed that says, I have a right to this land, much as you would in your home.
Yeah.
Let's compare it to a country that I hope all your listeners will agree is legitimate sovereigns over our land, the United States.
Yes.
Let's take our three prongs. First prong, we won it in a war,
Yep.
the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. But let's face it, it was an offensive war. George III did not want that war. We started that war at Concord and Lexington.
Yep.
Now, it was a just war. It was a moral war. But we started the war. It's a war of offense. George III, in fact, tells John Adams when he becomes the first ambassador to the Court of St. James, what does George III say? He says, I was the last to agree to the separation. He didn't want that war.
Right.
He wanted to keep us in his back pocket. So we started the war, but is it legitimate? Of course it's legitimate.
Yep.
Second prong, are we indigenous to this land? Of course not. We came to this country in 1607, but we came as Englishmen.
Yeah.
It wasn't until pretty much 1760, 1761, after the French and Indian War, in a trial in Boston, Massachusetts, where James Otis was the lawyer for the people whose homes had been searched without a warrant, precursor to our Fourth Amendment in the Constitution. Sam Adams, John Adams, young men sitting in the gallery watching the trial play out, very much moved by the patriotic things that James Otis was saying there. It really was then that we first started to say, hey, we're different than these English guys, and they're not treating us right. And in fact, towards the end of his life, John Adams would write in his memoirs that it was, quote, then and there, in that courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts, that the child revolution was born. That was 15, 16 years before the country was founded. Does that mean that we're not legitimate sovereigns over our borders? Of course not. Third prong. Do we have a document? Well, we have the greatest document. Well, one of the greatest documents of all time.
Yes.
The Declaration of Independence. But it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it was edited by the 5 members of the Committee on Style: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Livingston, and as a man with New Haven, Connecticut roots, Roger Sherman. He was like mayor of New Haven 12 times. He's like the Bibi Netanyahu of New Haven, Connecticut, okay?
He's the king.
He's the king. Who were these 5 men? They were all Americans, all rebels, all patriots. We don't have a document with another country that ratifies our right to exist as an independent country until Franklin negotiates the treaty with France several years later. But no one would deny that if 4,000 terrorists crossed the border from Mexico into San Diego tomorrow morning,
right,
and slaughtered 42,000 Americans, which is what it would be per capita,
Yeah.
what happened on October 7th, and took thousands more hostage and held them under the earth in deep, dark holes of Tijuana and surveilled them there with guns and without food or medicine for now it's 474 days. No one would say, oh, well, that's kind of okay because the Mexicans were just reclaiming their ancestral land and the Americans aren't indigenous.
No one
Nobody
would say that. No
right?
one.
But that's exactly what people said about Israel when it was attacked in that way. So let's compare the 3 prongs to Israel, the
Let's
Jewish state
do
of
it.
Israel. First prong, they have won the land in war after war after war. Not wars of offense, not wars they started, not
Wars of
wars they
defense.
wanted, wars of existential defensive survival. 48, attacked by 5 Arab armies. 67, 3 Arab armies, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. 1973, attacked by 6 Arab armies by surprise on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, as most of the Israeli army was at synagogue and at home fasting and in solemn prayer with their families. And still they won the land. Unquestionably legitimate under the law. Second prong, Jews didn't get to Israel 15 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 400 years ago. The first extra biblical mention of the Jews living and ruling in the land of Israel comes from the year 1205 BC. The Pharaoh of Egypt was a man named Merneptah. He's the son of Ramses, the great builder of ancient Egypt. And at the end of his life, he had his scribes compose a giant stele, which is a giant basalt black stone tablet that looks like the tablets that Moses would have brought down from Sinai if Moses could carry a 10,000-pound stone. And on that stele, Merneptah's scribes wrote down all of his military accomplishments. And at the very bottom, in 1205 BC, that's more than 3,200 years ago, Merneptah writes that he brought his Egyptian army to war in Palestine?
Yeah.
Of course not. No such thing has ever existed in history. Brought his Egyptian army into Israel and fought the king of Israel in battle in places like Gezer and Ashkelon, two cities that are still in the land of Israel today.
Wow, I didn't know this.
And there are many more pieces of archaeological evidence like that. In Jordan, for example, the kingdom that was ruling there at the time was called the Moabites. You remember that from the Bible?
Yeah.
The Moabite king in the 840s was named Mesha. He wrote his own stele in 840 BC. He writes that he made war against the sons of the king of Israel across the Jordan River, where Israel is today. And he said something else amazing. He says he made war against the tribe of God, G-A-D.
Right.
You'll remember that God is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the original 12 tribes of Israel. And then he says this. He says, those men, the men of God, have lived in that land, the land of Israel, since ancient times. Even in 840 BC, the people who lived and ruled in the land we now know as Jordan recognized that Jews had lived in the land of Israel since ancient times.
Yeah.
Arabs, just for context, they're not from Israel, okay? They're from Arabia, hence the name.
Yes.
They don't arrive in Israel until the 600s AD.
Right.
Muhammad isn't born until 570 AD. Islam isn't a thing in the world until 610, 615 AD. That means that Jews were living and ruling in the land of Israel for more than 1,800 years, at least, before Islam was even a thing in the Middle East. You asked me about the definition of an occupation. You cannot occupy your own home. You cannot trespass in your own home. The land of Israel has been the home of the Jewish people for thousands of years. You cannot occupy your own home. So that's the second prong. And then the third prong, do we have a document? Well, yes, we have a document. We don't just have, the Jews, a Declaration of Independence, although there is that, a Declaration of Independence from 1948. And I know for all your listeners, maybe there are some who care about the rights of women. I know that's passé these days. We don't care about the rights of Jewish women who were raped and violated. We certainly don't believe them when they testify like we would other women. But your listeners should know that it's one of the first declarations of independence anywhere in the world signed by women, including one woman, Golda Meirson, who would become Golda Meir, the first female prime minister of the land of Israel. We still haven't done that in the United States. I don't know if you've heard, have a female president.
We need to
in the
get a
United
good
States.
candidate.
I'm just saying. So that's that. But we do have more than that. There isn't just a Declaration of Independence. There's also an international decree voted on by the representatives of the combined nations of the world in General Assembly 2 times. In 1947, the combined nations of the world, ratifying the ancient claim of the Jewish people to the land, voted 33-13 to give the Jews part of their ancestral homeland. Then the Arab nations invaded. The Jews, to everyone's surprise, a tiny army of 600,000, won the war by the beginning of 1949. And guess what? President Truman says to Ben-Gurion, go back to the United Nations and make sure everyone's cool with it after the war.
Yeah.
And Ben-Gurion says, no, we got our vote. We don't want to go back.
Yeah.
And Truman says, go back and get it ratified.
Yeah.
And they did. And they won this time by an even bigger margin, 37-12.
Wow.
Recognizing, again, the ancestral home of the Jewish people. So whichever way you slice it, defensive wars won, blood, sweat, and tears on the land, time and again. Or second, indigenous claim to the land. The Jews are the original occupants of that land. There's no dispute in the archaeological evidence. There is no evidence of anything called the Palestinian people anywhere near thousands of years ago. The name Palestine was only a name that was given by the Romans after Vespasian and Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD as a way of wiping out the Jewish claim to the land. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. It has nothing to do with Arabs who did not arrive in the land until hundreds of years later.
Right.
And third, Israel has an international decree from the combined nations of the world recognizing its ancient claim to the land and recognizing the land as the ancestral home of the Jewish people. And still Israel is being called a settler colonialist state in international tribunals around the world. A preposterous claim.
Judge, talk to me about the ICC, ICJ court. I've heard many times it's a monkey court, but why are we even giving our attention to this court? What type of power does this court have? I know major member states are not even a part of this court. So, is it a legitimate court?
Well, there are two different courts. The ICC court has essentially no power.
Okay.
It can issue warrants for people's arrest, and countries can decide, who are signatories can decide whether they will or will not enforce those. You've seen that many countries in the world have said they're not going to enforce the warrants against Yoav Gallant and Prime Minister Netanyahu. A couple things about the ICC court. First of all, the most important players in the global community aren't members to the ICC court. The United States, for example, not a signatory. Israel, relevant here, not a signatory, which means off the bat, the ICC has absolutely no jurisdiction over Israeli officials whatsoever. So the case should have been thrown out on jurisdictional grounds from day one. Second, and more importantly, even if the court were to find some bogus claim to jurisdiction, the fact of the matter is that the ICC court is built on this thing called the doctrine of complementarity. Okay. What does that mean?
What does that mean?
The ICC court is a complementary court. It supplements. It doesn't substitute for domestic courts.
Okay.
So it really only is meant to apply in situations where the governing regime is so powerful that it dominates the judicial system in its own country. So we as an international community cannot trust that that country's judicial system will ever put the leaders of the government in prison or prosecute them in any way because the government controls the judicial system. It's a way of saying, if you have a robust and independent judiciary, we won't mess with that system. We'll only involve ourselves where it's like Sudan, or Rwanda, where there's no such thing, or Syria, or countries like that, where there's no such thing as an independent judiciary, okay? There is no dispute that Israel's judicial system, as we discussed in the judicial reform discussion we had at the beginning of our episode, is one of the most independent, most robust in the world. In fact, the only criticism that has been levied at the Israeli judicial system is that it's too independent and too powerful. Remember, the issue is that Israel's Supreme Court isn't tied in any way to the government. The government doesn't get to nominate the judges. It doesn't get to fire or dismiss the judges. It doesn't even get to create a constitution like we do that binds the judges' decision-making. So it's far more independent, far more robust, and far more powerful even than our federal judiciary, which is the beacon of the world.
So a state like Israel doesn't need the ICC court.
So there's no plausible argument that the ICC should ever involve itself in claims against Israeli officials because of the independence of the Israeli judicial system. But here's one more thing about that. Remember what I told you at the beginning. What we're afraid of, what the doctrine of complementarity is all about, is a judicial system that's too afraid to prosecute its own government officials. Does Does that sound preposterous to you? The Israeli judicial system is even today prosecuting Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, on corruption charges. He's not in trial for one offense or two offenses. He has 3 separate indictments against him.